If the Bible is supposed to be a guide containing moral absolutes, how can it be that that same Bible has God sanctioning the mass killing of innocent people?
Many will even call God cruel because of his actions in the Old Testament. But first, how do we respond to those who say that the Bible is unreliable because words themselves have no meaning? Here's RZIM speaker Amy Orr-Ewing in part 3 of her message.
So this challenge of both the written and the spoken word by the postmodern authors, the denial that there could be a disinterested knower or any possibility that we can stand behind history or any human society in a vantage point which could offer us certain knowledge. It's a total denial of that. It's the idea that truth cannot be objective or theoretical, but truth must be a fabrication, a fiction, or a system of ordered procedures for the production, regulation, distribution, circulation, and operation of statements. In other words, it's connected to power. When we use words, we are taking power over other people. Any attempt to make a truth claim, to assert truth about a historical event or any kind of other reality is just power play. And it's just your opinion. It's completely relativized. So the Bible is seen as the ultimate tool of manipulators. The Bible, making any kind of claim to authority over your life or over my life, is the ultimate evil, if such a thing could exist within the postmodern worldview. Because what it is doing is trying to change your mind, your life, your ideas with a play to power, when there is no such thing as truth, and all views are equally valid. Now, of course, the problem here, which many have pointed out, is that if words are tools of oppressors and used by powerful people to control others, and if words are not capable of really carrying ultimate meaning, aren't Foucault and Derrida and Lyotard doing exactly the same thing they accuse the Bible of doing, by writing books with words? As one teacher of philosophy admitted, to hold a postmodern view of language, really the only thing you can do with any integrity is be silent. That sounds appealing. That challenge is a challenge that we face, and which particularly emerging generations face, which our young people in your churches, your children, grandchildren, and any younger people who are here today will face. The relativization of the written word and of the spoken word as well. Then particularly, and I think this is one of the most difficult ones, the moral challenge. And it's interesting to me that this is a present day challenge, and it's a challenge which I think is coming up more and more. If the Bible is supposed to be a guide containing moral absolutes, how can it be that that same Bible has God sanctioning the mass killing of innocent people? Out of interest, who's been asked that question in the last year? Okay, lots of us. Isn't there a contradiction here? The God of love, the God of the New Testament we hear, who's loving and kind, surely is in contradiction with this kind of God who orders people to go and kill other people. A moral challenge. We're going to look at 3 important factors for us as Christians in trying to answer this question. The first is the idea of judgment. The second is about strategy. And the third is about history and the historical time period we're talking about. Now, I don't want to suggest to you, I think this is probably the most difficult question that we as apologists and all of us as Christians face at the moment, in my opinion. Because I do believe that we can begin to answer this question, but it takes time. And we need some broad brushstrokes. It's very difficult to answer this question in a 2-minute soundbite, which we're often expected to be able to do. So let's try and look at it together. This challenge to the moral authority of the Bible, because God commands killing. Well, I think the first question we need to ask when we're looking at this question ourselves is to ask whether war is ever a good thing. Is it a demonstration of goodness to show no opposition to evil? You see, when we look at war, and particularly in the Old Testament, we see that the context within which it appears in the text of the Bible is within a context of God as a moral lawgiver who judges between good and evil. And that when wars happen in the Old Testament, they are a part of that framework of moral judgment. One of the means, in other words, of God's judgment in the Old Testament is war. Now, it's really important for us at this moment to note that it isn't always God's chosen people, Israel, who bring about God's will on the battlefield. In fact, more frequently, God's chosen people are on the receiving end of his judgment in war. If you read the pages of the Old Testament, you see it's far more frequently the other way round. Then secondly, we look at the issue of strategy, of military strategy. We need to understand, first of all, that the command to kill the women and children is not the general rule of the Old Testament. It is the exceptional circumstance. And the reason given in Deuteronomy 20, verses 16 to 18 is that otherwise they will teach you to follow all the detestable things that they do in worshipping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. And this is assuming a context of child sacrifice, of the male oldest son being placed into the burning hands of a metal idol which has a huge fire in it and being burned as an act of worship. So when God commands the Israelite army to go in and to destroy the inhabitants of the city Jericho, and then later we see it with the Amalekites in 1 Samuel, we need to understand, the context of judgment, that this is happening not only to those people, but the Israelites are also on the receiving end of God's judgment. But we also need to understand that this is a real war, and so military strategy is coming into play here. When it comes to the issue of war policy, we can distinguish between the theoretical and the practical aspects of war. And it's really important. One scholar called von Clausewitz has looked at this from the perspective of military strategy today and looked at the Old Testament in the light of that, and I think has brought some interesting things to light. And what he says is that in a war, the aggressor has three objectives: to destroy the military might of the enemy, which is necessary to eliminate the potential for counter-aggression, to conquer the enemy's territory, and to annihilate their will to fight. And so when we read about war policy in Deuteronomy 20, or we read about the rhetoric of war, in other words, the words written about war, we need to understand that military discourse, and that's what this falls into when God makes the commandment about an army going to war, entails a twofold intent. Firstly, to demoralize the enemy, and secondly, to maintain and boost morale against the troops. So the language is important. Now, I'm not saying that God wasn't saying go and do it, but that part of that statement is the military strategy involved. Then the third thing is the limited time frame. You see, the ban, or the herem as it is called, only happens and is only worked out in two historical examples. And even then, it's interesting, these things are not completely and absolutely followed through. And so we need to understand the historical and rhetorical context in which they're written. We read in the Battle of Jericho, Joshua chapter 6, and in 1 Samuel 15, where Samuel is called to wipe out the Amalekites, we see that in both those instances, the ban, herem, doesn't actually happen. In fact, I think Jericho is a very interesting example, because here Joshua is commanded to kill the inhabitants of Jericho. And yet, a few chapters before, we've read about Rahab, a prostitute, who allows the spies to stay in her home. And when she believes in them and in their God, she and all who will believe her message are saved, are rescued. Isn't it amazing that even in one of the most difficult passages in the Old Testament, the ban, herem, in Jericho, the command to wipe out all sorts of people, that even in the midst of that, God's grace is evident. And we see this woman, Rahab, and those who will take shelter in her home are spared. And you know what? She goes on to appear in the genealogy of Jesus. She becomes a mother, if you like, in the line of Christ. So even in the most difficult passage of the Old Testament to talk about, we see this grace. Now, these two cases where this intensive killing is commanded and to some extent carried out by Israel with the approval of God are difficult. I'm not denying that they are very difficult for us with our 21st century eyes to read, although we do need to understand the situation and the historical time periods. But what's most important here is to see that there is no sense of a carte blanche to go and do this or use this as an example, but rather that this happens within a period of struggle. And it is a moment of God's judgment on the detestable practice of killing children in the name of worshipping God.